Hello and welcome back to the second part of our roundtable discussion on the international standard ISO 45001. Just to remind viewers that the an edited version of this discussion will appear in the May issue of the magazine, and also that it will appear online on the Irish Magazine website. We've touched on context already, but I'd like to sort of revisit this with the experts here to look at some of the challenges that early registrants have found and how they might be overcome.
So I think context is an area that if organisations aren't familiar with a high level structure, it does seem a bit daunting. You know, what is this strange thing that we have to look at? But I think again, you know, it's not being daunted by the language. It's actually simple. So it's around starting with identifying those internal and external. Again, it uses the phrase issues, but the things that can have an impact on your organisation internally or externally. So that might be regulation externally, it might be insurance requirements, you know, it can be a whole range. And again, you know, within the annex and British Standards Institution, as Martin's already alluded to, have got guidance documents that are written in plain English that helps explain exactly what those are and gives examples. And you know, there you can use tools around, you know, sort of SWOT analysis or PESTLE to give you a framework to go through those, but simply brainstorming them, you know. So as an organisation, what is it that we can do and what can have an impact on how we can achieve that is the starting point. And then it simply goes on, and again it uses the phrase interested parties, and you know, we might use the phrase stakeholders in the UK, but who are the people internally and externally who have something to say about health and safety, or might be impacted by it. And again, you know, those examples are out there. So, you know, simply sitting down and brainstorming some of those questions is a really good starting point for understanding what's required under that particular clause.
Thank you. Gerard?
Most of the companies we've worked with, we've recommended SWOT analysis, which will pick up the internal and external issues. Notwithstanding the fact that the standard doesn't require documented information for clause 4.1, we generally recommend that the companies do document their context. So the strengths and weaknesses are identified as the internal issues, and the opportunities and threats are picked up from the external issues.
I'll come back to some of those points later on, but Martin, do you like to add anything?
Yeah, I think what Gerard and Kate have said is absolutely right. It is that structured analysis, and I think for me it's just a reminder for organisations that the management system is there as a risk management tool for the organisation. And so this context section, mysterious though it sounds, is actually just the opportunity to think, what are we trying to achieve? And in what environment and landscape are we trying to achieve it? And what's our internal situation? You know, are we an organisation which values and works systematically to procedures, or are we an organisation that likes a lighter touch and is more dynamic and flexible? And it's all just about customising the risk management system to the nature of that environment.
Terry?
I can only echo what everyone else has said in various ways, but I think it's that interpretation. Once the client understands, you know, all you're looking at is, why do they do something? Who are they doing it for? What are they trying to achieve by that? How do they know that they've achieved it? How do they measure that? And once you put it in pardon the pun, layman's terms, it's a, oh, well, there again, it floods into this, oh, we do this and we do that. It's that, just that initial interpretation of the language that's used, and I think once you get past that, it's greatly understood about context, because most organisations do this without even thinking. I think one of the difficulties of using Annex SL across various disciplines is that they don't, because they understand context in, let's say, a quality scenario, then it's not necessarily an easy transition to then say, but in occupational health and safety, it changes the dynamic. So they're used to the context in terms of quality product, quality service, etc. But in terms of OHS, it's already risk-based because we do all these risk assessments. Yeah, but what's your influence on this risk? What does this risk mean to your organisation? I think that's, which is then drawn out. So they may document the various contexts and the various things and say, we've done that, we've looked at this clause, but then the actual effectiveness of what that means to the management system is very different, because that's when we have the discussions with the chief execs and the various other people in the organisation to build on what they've written and say, so why did you perceive that as a risk? What was the threat there? And it's getting into the roots of why that was perceived in that particular way, or why is it an opportunity, not a risk, or is it actually a bit of both?
I think one of the early learnings that our clients found, particularly with that clause, was if they had ISO 9001 or ISO 14001, and therefore they had context within one or both of those management systems. It's just drawing out what you were alluding to, was that they assumed that they could just carry that across almost wholesale into 45001. And although a lot of it is there and you can carry a lot of it across, actually you do need to consider about what is different for each of those elements from a health and safety point of view. And again, coming back to the point we've made, it is important to really look at the detail, because for instance, it talks about workers and interested parties in 45001 rather than just interested parties in say 9,000 or 14,000. So I think that was something that some of our early clients kind of just missed to begin with.
Yes.
But we would generally recommend that a company has a single context document that reflects whatever management system standards they're complying with, rather than separate contexts. I think some in the article in IOSH, they talked about a company, if they didn't understand their context, they wouldn't be in business for very long. That also applies to the management system side as well. Yeah.
No, I mean, I'm glad you mentioned chief executives just now, because it sort of leads on to this other point that I was going to make around one of the explicit requirements of the standard is that management have to demonstrate developing, leading and managing safety culture. I was going to ask you, what sort of things should they be doing, Kate?
So again, I think this is one of the benefits of the standard in as it's quite detailed about what leadership have to do and have to demonstrate. So again, going through that detail, but some of the things that we'll be familiar with in terms of leadership inspection programs, walking the walk, not just talking the talk, so actually being visible, being on site, understanding and demonstrating that they are committed to looking after their workforce and making the workplace healthy. And I think, one of the things that a lot of organisations often fail to sort of clearly show a journey is, they're getting more involvement and from the workforce and suggestions coming in from the workforce, actually implementing those suggestions, because it shows that the commitment's there, but it keeps the engagement of the workforce there. And I think one of the things that I really like about 45001 from a leadership point of view is it does require leadership to protect workers from reprisals. So, I mean, again, it's not so much of an issue in the UK, because we have such a strong legislative environment around, again, health and safety participation of the workforce, and actually, if an individual worker raises a health and safety concern, there's protections in law, but that's really new and different for some parts of the globe. Yes. And for me, that's one of the things that's so exciting about 45001 is it's genuinely going to raise standards on occupational health and safety around the world, because it's going to ask organisations to do things that aren't necessarily part of their legislative framework.
I mean, I'll let other people come in a minute, but that's an interesting point because Arsh has a lot of members that work in the Middle East and the Far East. I mean, do you, and this is really open for anyone to come in on, what particular challenges do you see around the areas that Kate's just raised for companies working in other parts of the world? Any sort of kind of key sort of challenges that you can anticipate?
We've worked with some companies in other jurisdictions, and either the absence or the disregard of legislation is quite obvious, and it's very difficult to build a management system around a culture that isn't conscious of protecting workers, or indeed of protecting the environment in the case of ISO 14001.
Yeah, I think we've observed a difference between jurisdictions where sort of the natural culture is kind of top down and controlling, and then those requirements for worker participation and consultation are much harder to get going. I think another thing I've observed over the years is also, again, a sort of cultural difference between places where health and safety defaults to safety. And I'm not sure that this new standard has quite gone as far as it was originally planned that it might, in trying to emphasise health. It's one of the things which is good now about the fact that BSI has published a specific guidance standard on the health side of health and safety. For me, the learning point was actually, it's not the words that are wrong in the standard. It mentions health and safety very equitably.
Absolutely.
The problem is often with us as the reader and the people who apply the standard, is that we don't really apply health and safety very equally, because health issues are often less visible, less immediate. So I think there's possibly further to go on that one. But again, I've seen big cultural differences with that. Organisations where the OHS function is led by medical practitioners, and then you certainly see the health side coming through in a very powerful way.
Well, I was going to ask if there are any sort of examples that, but I was going to let Terry to come in on that first of all, and then I'll open it up again.
Yeah, I think one of the things, sort of in the UK, we talked about cultural and legislative framework. Well, a lot of cultures aren't really driven by the legislative framework. It's a bit of a blunt instrument, in fairness. If that's the only argument you've got for implementing something, then I would suggest it's not a very strong argument that there's a statutory requirement for you to do it, so therefore you must do it. We should be arguing the point on other grounds other than just the legal requirements, and it's about looking after individuals and the people and the workers as the biggest asset an organisation has got, and that is really important, both from an occupational health point of view and the safety. So and they should have equal standing. And I think culturally in the UK we're going through a bit of a migration on this cultural acceptance of that anyway. So I think all organisations and cultures, regardless where they're based, will go through this, but the standard's flexible enough to accommodate that movement over time, and that's what it's trying to achieve.
Did anyone want to come in on any sort of innovations in health that they've seen at all?
Well, I think as we move towards more of a service economy in much of the developed world, of course, there's a bit of a shift between physical hazards and psychological risks are becoming more prevalent and more dominant. The call centre environments are kind of one of the obvious areas where we've sort of become alert to the fact that there's more opportunity for stress, perhaps, in that kind of a workplace than perhaps for physical hazard. So, I mean, I'm encouraged by the fact that at the ISO level, one of the first deliverables for the new technical committee, which owns 45001, will be a guidance standard on psychological risk in the workplace. And of course, we already have UK guidance material on that topic. The Canadians also had. But it's encouraging that that was seen as one of the early priorities for the ISO committee, was that there should be something international specifically around psychological risk.
That's interesting. Does anyone want to come back on that at all?
I think it is interesting, and I think it's really exciting that we're going to have an international standard looking at this area, because one of the challenges is there aren't international definitions. But I think within a 45,001, you know, it's very clear that the expert committee that put it together did want to raise the agenda in terms of health, and again, you know, it defines injury and ill health as physical, mental and cognitive, you know, conditions. So the emphasis is there, and also, you know, when it's asking organisations to look at hazard identification, it starts with psychosocial risks. It starts with social factors, you know, work hours, bullying, harassment. And in case anybody's missed this, it also does talk about the fact that leadership and culture are hazards.
Okay, that's interesting.
We found when we went into companies that they had very robust risk assessments to do with physical, chemical, maybe biological hazards, but they hadn't addressed psychosocial hazards. So they took the opportunity as part of the implementation to address psychosocial hazards and to actually do a risk assessment.
That's good. That's really good. I'm going to come back to a point that has been touched on earlier, where we've talked about the need for an organisation to define external issues and interested parties. One of the points that came up in the article, which we ran earlier this year, was that for some of those early registrants, they found that this could be a much wider remit than they'd anticipated. What have you found?
I think it goes back to what we said earlier about the context being different per discipline of standards, shall we say, the quality context being very different. But there is a dynamic link between that context, isn't there? Between the context of the organisation's quality system, for example, when they're then looking at, so they look at supply, so have they looked at, so what impact has the OHS application module been applied to that? They probably haven't even looked at that. They've probably just gone, can they supply the right service or product at the right time, at the right price, etc., etc. So they've already potentially got mechanisms that are out that maybe just need some development, and I think that's getting that understanding across. It's not that things aren't there, it's probably that they're not necessarily being used for getting maximum value out of the work that they're already doing, really. They can develop those systems to deliver that.
We also recommend that companies go through the iteration as 4.1, 4.2 and then into 6.1, that they have to understand the context and the needs and expectations of interested parties before they can really undertake a risk assessment. So we would strongly recommend that that's the process they go through.
When you start looking at this, there's a temptation, I think, particularly for maybe smaller organisations who aren't familiar with the language or what's being required, to kind of, you know, think they've got to kind of chase a rabbit down a warren that's never ending. You know, in terms of, for instance, thinking about interested parties. But again, you know, just take a moment, step back, pause, and just be sensible and proportionate about it. Have a brainstorm, think about who's going to be impacted, and that's generally your group, you know. And then it's, you know, again, it's, you might have a you know, what seems like quite a long list of interested parties. These people who might be, you know, interested in your health and safety, but it doesn't mean that you've got to do something with all of them. You know, it's a logical step. You know, who are they? What might their interest be? Do we need to do anything, or don't we?
It's a systematic process, isn't it? Pardon the pun, but you know, it does need to be appropriate for the organisation, and I think it's not this big iceberg or whatever that they see in the distance or on the horizon that needs to be a threatening thing. It's actually quite an empowering opportunity, because there again, that context is a very dynamic element of the standard, and it isn't, oh, we've done the context so we can put that to bed and not look at it now for another however many months or years. It's actually, that context could change on a daily basis. And it's having the mechanisms there for that to connect to the rest of the organisation, and it works in an effective way. I think that's the critical path for context. And so, if it isn't right, you can change it. You can make it. It's having that flexibility.
And it is, in fact, an opportunity to look
Yes.
forward slightly as well, isn't it? Which again, you know, doesn't always happen. We tend to sort of default into, you know, the way things are today, whereas actually challenging, well, what's the business strategy? Will we be operating in either a different legislative environment, different markets? Are we aiming to deliver new services or products? You know, having that look ahead, can be an early opportunity to start tuning the management system in anticipation.
And I think just sort of building on that and coming back to one of the questions we had about leadership is that the management review within 45,001, does ask that the top management do look at that strategic objectives of the organisation, and it is forward thinking. And certainly the feedback that we've got from clients is that because the management review is more detailed, they're seeing much more engagement from leadership about those conversations, and much more engagement about what is the intention of our health and safety management system, what do we want to achieve with this.
That's good. I want to come back to a point that you made earlier, Kate, around worker participation, because we've touched on it, but we haven't really gone into a lot of detail about it. And it is a major element of the standard. What would you say are the good components of good participation? And what have you seen any sort of examples out there in industry that you could sort of bring into the discussion?
Communication. As a generic cover-all header, I would say communication is the key. Both transparent communication and a culture whereby it's encouraged. And that's, if somebody feels confident to be able to stop the chief exec when he's doing his site walkover or whatever and say, you're not doing that, or you don't need to be there, you need to move out, or you're not on the path, or that cultural indicator, that is a barometer of how effective the worker engagement is. And does it happen at 2 o'clock in the morning, or does it change? After 5 o'clock in the afternoon, does the culture change to such an extent that the organisation doesn't operate in the same way, shall we say? And that's the key.
Yeah, we would encourage companies to look at the clause and look at the actual, how prescriptive it is in terms of participation. And based on that, we would expect worker involvement in risk assessments, in incident investigations, in conducting audits and walkabouts and inspections, that they're actively involved in the health and safety management system rather than standing back and just looking at other people getting involved.
Have you seen any sort of good examples of that over the...
We've seen companies that didn't have a strong worker participation now realising that it's in their interests and that it's a good thing for it to happen. So we are seeing much greater participation on the part of workers.
Okay, that's good. Martin?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Previous standards have alluded to the value of worker participation, but then been very selective in the things which they've specified that it should be. And I think what this represents for me as a step forward is that it actually says workers should be involved in the whole plan, do, check out cycle. And now it really comes through clearly that, if you're involved in the planning, you're probably more committed to the delivery. You're going to be interested in the results, and you've got something to say about how to move on and improve. So to me, that's kind of the step change, is to say, well, it's not just about having workers involved in risk assessments because they're, crucially exposed to the hazard. It's actually about involving them in the whole system and the whole thought process of what are we trying to achieve, what level of performance is acceptable, and having them as part of that whole conversation. And I think, thinking of this as a business management standard, the spin-off benefits of having workers involved in all those conversations around that whole cycle, I think will spin off way beyond occupational health and safety, quite honestly. And those are the signs we're getting from some of our clients, is that, it does have that ripple effect.
That's something I was going to come on to later, but Kate, do you want to come in?
Yeah, so I think I've seen quite a few sort of examples that I think are interesting, and again, organisations have looked at what's going to work best for them. So one of the examples that I've seen, and it's interesting, we started this conversation with saying you don't need to change your terminology, but one of the organisations that I was speaking to have actually changed their toolbox talks to participation briefings. And they made that decision because actually they felt that it was an easier way to explain to their workforce how they were demonstrating conformance to 45001. Another innovation that I've seen is for a large construction company that they're using QR codes. So each site has an individual QR code which is linked to a reporting app, so that if a worker sees an issue, or good practice, which is really important, you know, because 45 talks about opportunities, and it's important that they can scan the QR code, that there's a very simple, just a few questions on the app, and then it gets sent through into a central database where that's then held and analysed, you know, to looking for trends. And I think what was nice about that was it could be anonymous. So if an individual was concerned about maybe reporting something, you know, they had the ability to make it anonymously. So I think, you know, there is some very good detail out there, and good examples.
Does anybody else want to add anything?
I think it's interesting there that technology is playing a really vital role now in this communication process. We talk about apps and the various. So the traditional methods are to some extent falling to the wayside. The traditional, oh, we've held a meeting, we've done whatever. Or it's more about more dynamic, it's more responsive, everybody's got mobile phones, they use an app, they record this, both positive and negative, which is really good. And a lot of companies are embracing that, both just in the management systems generally. It's an app that they can report this, do that, change this, request that. So the communication process within organisations is changing to reflect society, I think.
On technology, I mean, do you see any sort of emerging technologies which are not quite there yet, which could take this further?
I think there's a lot of dalliance with technology. I think the best way to explain it, you know, I think there's a recognition that technology can help, but we haven't necessarily worked out what that means or how best to use it. So, you know, there's a lot of research going on and looking at wearables, you know, in terms of technology, you know, smart safety vests, particularly in hot environments for monitoring temperature or whatever it happens to be, you know. So I think there's a lot going on, and I think over time, as happens with technology, the best solutions will stay, and some of the stuff that we're seeing at the moment just aren't practical and therefore fall by the wayside. And I think we've seen that a little bit in some of the virtual reality training that a lot of organisations are exploring. You know, I think there's a recognition that that sort of training solution has a potential value, but it's not necessarily as immersive as it needs to be in actually changing behaviour. So I think, you know, yeah, there's a lot going on. I think some technology will stick and some of it will just not, because it won't be practical.
Yeah, I'd have concerns about the use of some of the software that's used for different elements of management systems, audits, risk assessments. It works very well if the company has a robust system in place before they actually try to implement it electronically. But I found a lot of, I suppose, going through the motions with some of the software if the system isn't robust enough.
Okay.
I guess there's a management of change issue here as well, isn't there? Let's be honest. You know, some workers will be much more enthusiastic and keen to be early adopters. And other colleagues may struggle with those changes. So actually one of the challenges is actually determining the right pace of change for your own organisation and helping those who need, you know, support along that journey.
We've touched on this in the discussion so far. We've looked at continual improvement. Are there sort of any good examples that you might be able to give, Martin?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that, just as we've said right through this conversation, it's all about the context of an individual organisation. So the things which are important for one organisation and priorities for improvement will be different from any other organisation. So it's difficult to suggest, you know, start with A and then consider B. I think the other part of it is this use of the word continual, which has been a source of some discussion and continues to be in terms of the way the standards are written in the future. That tends to lead us to think in terms of these small incremental year-on-year improvements that we can make to our systems in order to enhance performance. But I think we also need to link it to the word in the standard, opportunity, because that opens up the whole issue of those more transformational but perhaps more occasional changes that can be made in the life of the organisation, where a particular set of circumstances come together and enable something more dramatic to be done with an OHS benefit. And for me, that's often about asking the question about, are there decisions being made about the future of the organisation in which the OHS function isn't represented and isn't contributing, and hence are we in danger of missing an opportunity because things roll on without that OHS input at that critical time. And I think that's probably where the greater gain is for many organisations. We're already attuned to continual improvement, but really making the most of those opportunities for innovative step change, I think will bring greater benefit.
The opportunities for continual improvement are quite evident from a reading of the standard. So I think if companies took the opportunity of giving feedback to workers or workers' representatives about where continual improvement is actually occurring, and that feedback can come via the management review clause or the audit feedback or feedback on non-conformance corrective actions, I think they should communicate where continual improvement has been achieved.
And presumably by doing that, you're going to sort of encourage more positive sort of
Encourage people, motivate people to be more proactive in terms of improving the health and safety performance.
Okay, thank you. Martin, you mentioned earlier about the ripple effect from ISO 45001. One thing we haven't touched upon, which is really important, is around how it could help raise standards across the supply chain. Do you want to sort of come in on that?
Yeah, I'd love to, because it's an issue of real concern actually to ISO Technical Committee 283, because we're very conscious that one of the few metrics we have around the penetration of the standard relates to certification. And of course, certification isn't the name of the game for all organisations by any means. And if you look at global OHS performance, actually it's the performance of smaller organisations which is probably the greatest concern. That's the landscape in which the world of standards has least impact and least penetration. And it's also the world to which actually certification is probably least relevant. So in the technical committee, we've kind of specified one of our objectives is to try and improve the uptake and use of the principles embedded in these standards amongst smaller organisations, because that's where we'll hopefully see the greatest potential improvement in global OHS performance. So I think that's the challenge, is how do you access that SME sector. One of the debates we had when the committee met 2 weeks ago in Dallas was, well, how do you influence that sector? Because they're rather off the radar in terms of the world of standards, or vice versa, standards is off their radar. And we had quite a debate about the role of the supply chain, because of course it's a very powerful mechanism to encourage other organisations to take an interest in OHS and to develop OHS systems. But the danger is that what happens is that you get OHS management pushed down supply chains, and sometimes indeed very specifically certification pushed down the supply chain. And I think there are two issues with that. One, things which are imposed on you, I think we all know that from daily life, are not embraced wholeheartedly. So it's something of a grudge purchase, quite frankly, and people then tend to take a tick box approach. So I think that's one concern. Perhaps the bigger concern for me is this, that organisations often tend to expect their suppliers to have management systems like their own. And of course, if we understand anything about the context section of the standard, the one thing it's telling us is the management system ought to look pretty different because it's a different organisation. And that's my fear, is that if we rely on the supply chain to be our vehicle for communicating and influencing smaller organisations, we need to be very smart about the messaging to remind people to look for something appropriate to their supplier's context, and recognise that might look and feel very different to the level of formalisation and documentation that you choose to have yourselves.
Terry, I wanted to bring you in. Did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I think one of the things, certainly from a certification body and an assessment organisation, one of the key messages that we want to deliver to, and benefits we want to deliver to our clients, is the registration is to some extent a secondary consideration to the process. It shouldn't be the primary driver, because if you embrace the intention and the requirements of the OHS management system to make it effective within your organisation, for one thing, continual improvement based on action will be a natural output anyway because of the way it's structured, and for the other, we should be selling and banging the drum for the benefits of protecting workers is the right and good thing to do. And that's the primary goal of the management system. And I think we have an obligation, certainly as a certification body, to sell that as a benefit, rather than we're looking at purely meeting the requirements of the standard to get the registration certificate or whatever else. And that's where I think the challenges are. And you're right about the cascading of we're only getting this because we're in the supply chain that requires it. Well, okay, we accept that might be the primary commercial consideration, but we should be selling then. Well, let's embrace it and get the benefits of that, because it can give you far more than just the accreditation process. And I think that's the real message that needs to go out from everyone.
Okay. Kate, did you want to add anything at all?
I think very good points have been made, and I think it is essential to bear that in mind. I think we are seeing it cascade down the supply chain. There's no two ways about it. But I think in some circumstances, that's actually for very good reasons. So particularly we're seeing it in automotive. So for suppliers within the automotive sector, IATF does recognise that 45001 has value and actually can be a good way of demonstrating health and safety management for an organisation. And I think that comes from a place where organisations recognise that good health and safety has broader benefits. So it improves quality, it improves productivity, and that's where it's being driven from. And I think also, particularly for our global organisations, there's much more focus on, we can call it the sustainability or the corporate responsibility agenda. Actually, what is their role in genuinely improving the lives for people, and I think for larger organisations, they recognise that they are in a position to help and encourage smaller organisations to do that. But I'd agree completely with the point. If it's mandated as a must-have and it's got to look a certain way, then the system's broken and it's not going to work.
Yeah, we have found the implementation of that particular element of the standard to be the most problematic, in that larger companies aren't quite sure what level of control they need to impose on their supply chain, and we would recommend to them that they adopt a more nuanced approach, particularly with the smaller contractors. By all means, encourage them to implement management system or to implement or improve their health and safety performance, but do it in a way that allows them to implement it, subject to limited financial or human resources within the smaller company. We've seen examples of where large companies have been effective at that, and we've also seen instances where they've just imposed it to the degree that they've disencouraged the smaller companies to become involved.
Interesting. Just thinking, with what we've discussed so far, are there any sort of key areas that you feel that we haven't talked about yet that we should include in the discussion?
I think it's probably worth just highlighting to our readers and watchers that 18001 now has a limited lifespan. So 18,001 will be withdrawn in March 2021. So organisations that wish to maintain their health and safety management system will need to migrate to 45,001. So there is a deadline associated with that. And I think, it's worth mentioning that there are different ways organisations can do that. They can kind of do it as in a single go. They can do it over a period of time. So there's quite a lot of flexibility about the approach to take, but organisations do need to start thinking about what that journey is going to look like, so they don't find themselves in sort of February 2021 with a couple of weeks to go and lots of work to do.
So that time will go by quicker than they probably anticipate.
And of course we had that experience with ISO 9001 and ISO 14001, and again it's kind of in the spirit of the standard, isn't it, that it's about planning. And not just planning yourself, but actually planning with your certification body, because they too have to plan to have the resources available when you need it. So if everybody wants to be certified in the last 3 months, that becomes a bit of a challenge, and not everybody's going to get what they want. So yes, there's definitely a lesson learned, I think, from those last new standard transitions, which hopefully will carry over to this.
Okay, Gerard?
We'd recommend companies look at their documented information and not necessarily transfer all of their documents and across over to the new system, that they should take the opportunity to rationalise or to look closely at what documentation they have and maybe eliminate or I know I recommended earlier on that the manual was good, but they should still take the opportunity to try to rationalise some of their documentation.
That's a good point. Terry?
I would go back to performing some form of strategic gap analysis. Initially, why do you need the standard? What's driving you for that requirement? Think seriously about what that is, because that, when you understand that, will help you enormously on the journey forward. And don't see it as an intimidating barrier. It's an enabling management system. It's quite dynamic and flexible. Don't be intimidated by all the terminology or the clause numbers and all the rest of it, because it's in real terms about practical, effective operational control, and that's what it's about.
Okay. Well, I think that's a great point to finish on. So thank you very much for joining us, and just to remind viewers again that the edited version of this discussion will appear in the May issue of Irish Magazine, and the recording will appear online in the next month or so. But I just want to thank our experts for joining us, and thank you for watching.